Hey everybody, Gabriel Miguel here, founder, executive director of the Anastasia Foundation. And today I have a very special guest, a dear friend, mentor, father figure, just a great person in my life who I'm very glad to have, Jonah Wittkamper, and one of my best friends in the world, who is his brother, Wesley Wittkamper. And this is an incredible dynamic duo here. You guys may know Wesley from some of our previous videos and events and things. But Jonah, this is his first time here, hopefully not his last. I'll do my best to make it attractive for him to come back. But Jonah is the co-founder and president of Nexus, which you guys may have heard me talk about before, and the Amazon Investor Coalition, the Global Governance Philanthropy Network, and the Healthy Democracy Coalition. So Nexus is a global movement of over 6,000 young people from 70 countries dedicated to bridging communities of wealth and impact. It's an incredible network. They've done so much great things in the world, and you guys will see that a little bit later. The Amazon Investor Coalition advances forest-friendly economic development of the Amazon region of South America. The GGPN unites funders to collaborate on transnational issues, and the Healthy Democracy Coalition connects funders to collaborate on U.S. policy. The various networks involve people from many of the world's most philanthropic families, and Jonah has organized global networks of young philanthropists for more than a decade now, I think, and has inspired a lot of new charitable activity from many wealthy families. And so, Jonah, thanks for taking the time to be here. Welcome.
Good to be here.
Yeah. So I would love for people to get to know you a little bit, just a little about your story and how you got into all these things. And then we can probably talk about Nexus, your current work in the Amazon. And so for everybody watching this, by the way, Jonah has a huge amount of experience and knowledge of philanthropy at the highest levels, and has lots of things to share about how we can make the Ringing Cedars movement more successful, emulating some of the things that he's done or that he's seen in the past and that he's doing now. So for everybody who's watching, I think his experience is really gonna do a lot for you. So stay tuned and see all that. So Jonah, if you want to just talk a little bit about like how you got into all these things and your story, that'd be awesome.
Sure. So I consider myself to be an activist. Someone trying to make a systemic change in global affairs away from a pathway of unsustainability towards one of collaboration with biodiversity and human thriving. My know-how for organizing people really started when I was 15 years old. So when you say, how did I get started? I go back to a story when I was 15 years old. I was living in New York City. I didn't have too many friends. I got to go to this international summer camp called Camp Rising Sun, where I got to meet young people from 35 countries. And I realized there that the future of the world could work not despite diversity, but because of diversity. I learned the art of celebrating diversity. Another way to describe it is the art of inclusion, because I, as a high schooler, had been ostracized. And by being in a community where I felt included, I wanted to include everyone else in the world. And when I got back to school, I decided to be one of those students who knew or who learned the first and last name of every other student in the school so that I could help include those who had been ostracized like me. And that pattern of inclusion and building bridges and helping to facilitate collaboration and diversity has been the pattern that I have sought to express globally ever since. I ran into some streaks of luck. I picked up some computer skills at school, and I was able to apply those to the emerging youth movements in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And I co-founded a global association of youth organizations around the United Nations in January of 2000. It was called the Global Youth Action Network. And soon our website was the largest on the internet for youth activism. And by our third year, we had mobilized 1 million people. And I realized that young people represent a strategy for transforming the world. When young people participate in a process, they learn about the process, whether it's politics or identity development. They learn about the flaws in that process. In many cases, they can then spend the next few decades of their career improving the process so that the political process can become better, or the identity development process can become better, etc. Young people represent a very key entry point for creating global systemic change. Along the way, I met young people from a couple of wealthy families who wanted to, well, dozens of, who wanted to get involved in nonprofits and didn't know how or where. And because our network had contacts with young changemakers in basically every country in the world, we became very useful in helping people to get connected. And that plays into this pattern of helping people feel included. So instead of wealthy people being ostracized because they are wealthy, many of them would participate in networks like this without identifying themselves as coming from wealth. But by creating elements, or by creating environments where they felt included, they could show up with their own strengths. They could show up to be a journalist or a fashion designer, whatever it was that might be their passion, and money would, come along for the ride as sort of a secondary follow-on effect of the way that they could make a contribution to whatever movement they were getting involved in. In this process, I fell in love and moved to Brazil and got married. My wife worked at the Kellogg Foundation, which at the time was one of the larger grant makers in the country in Brazilian philanthropy. And so I became a little bit familiar with that territory. And so I was in this unique position of helping young people from wealthy families understand what philanthropy is, but also having some access to institutional philanthropy. And then realizing that there was a spectrum, that for every family in the world that gives away $1 million a year, there are 500 other families that could afford to do so, but have not yet started to figure out how. And consequently, if we
staggering
that, yeah. And so if we improve, it's not that those 1 out of every 500 don't want to, they just don't know how. They don't have the relationships, the access to the knowledge of suffering around the world, etc. And so if we could improve that on-ramp, then we could bring dozens of new families into this process of how to make impact, where money is part of the story. In 2007, I got an opportunity to help build technology for Obama. I realized that if I could collaborate with the White House, it would be a means towards an end to get the White House to host its first Young Philanthropy Summit. So I took the job and helped build a text messaging platform used by the 2007-2008 Obama campaign. Obama won. All these doors opened up to me. I was able to get the Obama White House to host its first ever Young Philanthropy Summit. And then I used that as a galvanizing moment to get all of these disparate philanthropy networks that exist around the world to nominate people to go to the White House. And then I brought that network to the United Nations the following year, and it became the first UN Global Young Philanthropy Summit. We created the brand Nexus to surround that. That first event had 300 people participate. The next year we had events in Europe and China. And next year after that, it was a couple more countries. And for the first few years, we were doubling in size almost every year.
And Jonah, your first event at the UN was in 2010, 2011?
July 2011.
Yep.
So just to finish the story of Nexus. So the formula for Nexus events is 2/3 people from families that have had success in business, wealthy families, 1/3 young change makers. And that represents a bridge between communities of wealth and communities of impact. A systemic problem in philanthropy historically has been wealthy people talking to wealthy people about how to solve problems of the world. And that does not democratize philanthropy. By creating this bridge between young change makers and young wealth holders, suddenly it helps democratize the conversation about how to use money for impact. Another thing that needs to be mentioned about Nexus is that as an organization has a non-solicitation policy. So it's off limits to just go in the community and start pitching everybody for funding. Hey, make you a donation to me, make a donation to me. That poisons the well of a generative conversation. Instead of a community dedicated to transactions, which is what it would be if that pitching was encouraged. It instead is a community developed dedicated to relationship development. We say it's a relational event instead of a transactional event. And that innovation in the philanthropic education sphere has allowed it to really spread. About 5 years ago, Nexus, by that point in time, we had several thousand people and families involved. I reduced my role to start creating new platforms for intergenerational philanthropic learning and collaboration. I discovered that there are older generations that have the wealth, maybe some under awareness of impact. Younger generations, they travel the world, they may be aware of some of this suffering that exists overseas. They want to do something about it. There's this tension. Granddad has these, one vision of the world, limited capacity, limited time. Son or grandson might have more time, new vision, and Nexus worked because it attended to the needs of a generational demographic, but that really moving the needle on the global philanthropic question was limited because there's limited intergenerational collaboration. So I created these 3 new platforms to facilitate cross-generation philanthropic learning and collaboration. One for US democracy, one for global governance reform, and now most recently, the Amazon Investor Coalition. And I can get deeper into that because it has a significant overlap with the Anastasia movement in terms of nature preservation.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Their broad general background.
One thing that I would shed more light on as far as Nexus is concerned. So in the same way that he was talking about his early experience in high school, going to this camp with people from around the world, that diversity has been translated to the Nexus community. So the Nexus community isn't just wealth holders, it's also young social entrepreneurs. It's people from every single socioeconomic background, cultural background. And this biodiversity culture allows resiliency and makes for a great learning platform. And the sense that, how traveling is probably the best form of education. You go to a Nexus conference and you're traveling around the world just there because of the number of people who are coming from around the world. And then as far as what I would say, as far as the latest work that we've been doing with the Amazon Investor Coalition is creating the reforestation economy. And this is what really dovetails with the Anastasia movement.
Right. And listening to your story, it's very interesting how this idea of inclusion has always been there. And that is one of the things that I love about Nexus in general, is that also the non-solicitation policy, because you keep it you've created this space where people feel safe and free to be who they are and to exchange with each other and relate with each other freely and openly without any pressure about their money or where they come from or expectations about anything. And it's a unique space, like you said, like in the whole philanthropic world, because in most other places you go, it's just like, it's kind of they're trying to get money or whatever it is. And I wanted to tell a little story about something that I witnessed there to help people understand kind of the impact of that work and what Nexus actually does. So I remember I was in a session at one of the summits, and it was the New York summit, I believe, or no, it was DC. And I don't know, what was it, like 600, 700 people? Jonah, you know these things better than me. And it was a session there was a lot of indigenous speakers there, indigenous people to North America, South America. And I don't even know, Jonah, you might have been in that session. That seems like something you might have been in on. But at some point during the session, there was a man who was a wealth holder from a family that I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, had a lot to do with the railroads in this country, in the US. I'm not going to mention him by name. You probably know what I'm talking about. And I remember that he's in front of all these wonderful, inspiring Indigenous activists. And he basically just starts to cry. And he says, I recognize the harm that my family has done to all of your people. And I'm so sorry. I don't even know what to do to begin repairing this. Can you help me? You know what I mean? And he's sobbing in front of this room, and a few of the Indigenous people, they come and they embrace him, and it starts this beautiful relationship. So this is someone who comes from like a really wealthy and powerful family, talking with people who are really at the front lines of their people and their society, and trying to make change on that level, and having that super authentic connection, and also helping transmute some of this old karma, these old actions into something new and positive and regenerative going forward. And so I wanted to share that so people can get a sense of like what happens there. And yeah, like it's a beautiful space where things like that can happen, and it's very unique.
Hearing your story reminds me of an experience I had in Japan, maybe about 5 years ago. I was in a conversation about wealth and philanthropy with some powerful families and some people from the media. And there was this question of the culture of philanthropy. And the question was, shouldn't the government just solve all these problems? Why depend on private people? And my response was, governments don't have emotions. Human beings do. And look at that transformational experience of the next generation wealth holder talking about, you know, his family legacy and the criminal perpetrations that happen and the pain that resulted with Indigenous communities, and that extraordinary bond of someone, you know, willing to be vulnerable and make new friends and figure out how to use that legacy money for, you know, a more just and sustainable future, right? That a government can't do that. So
Right.
Our society, even our economic system, depends on human relationships and the emotions behind those relationships. And when we create these mega systems that create derivatives of new financial products that make things wealthier or more valuable through the undermining of human relationships, we lose our connection to the base. We lose our connection to nature, and the nitrogen cycle, and you name it. So that testimony you hear, you mentioned, I actually hadn't heard it before. It's really amazing. I'm gonna.
That was one of the most powerful things I ever saw at Nexus. It really moved me permanently.
I was in that session.
Well,
yeah, you remember that, Wes, right?
Yeah.
I've heard similar sessions like that. You know, there are dozens of stories like that in the network of people having these transformational experiences and then changing the direction of their lives as a result, which is one reason why Nexus has spread all over the world and has become so popular, because it really fills a niche in this quest to figure out how to use money for impact, and in the quest of individuals and figuring out how to disentangle yourself from the disease of materialism that seems to plague so many ultra high net worth families.
God, that's so well said. And one thing that I really wanted to highlight for people is that it was very interesting for me in my experience to be part of Nexus. I worked with Nexus for a couple of years and participated in a bunch of the events and so forth. And, you know, to be able to witness the fact that we have a lot of misconceptions about people who have wealth. Some people may assume that all people who have high levels of wealth all have like malicious intent, or they operate from this extractive point of view, or you may not even know or be aware of the very interesting like family dynamics, where usually it's the next generation of people, the children of that family, who are trying to change the legacy of the family and trying to repair all that past harm, and people who actually have really benevolent intent but really just need guidance. right? And it's like, until you can kind of see these things, they need guidance, they need inspiration, they need to feel safe, they need all these things, which Nexus so amazingly provides for all of them. And so that's just something I want people to be aware of, because what I really want everyone to understand is that, like, through these authentic, real connections with human beings, we can really make these changes, right? Like, Jonah, you have so many stories. I think you had a story. You went to dinner. There was with a group of Brazilians, and one of them was from a wealthy family. And basically, over dinner, that person was inspired, and that led to like a large amount of giving. I know you've told me this story more than once, but like something like that. Just can you tell a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, there've been a bunch of stories like that. But in general,
Yeah.
the pattern is, someone is really scared for the future of humanity. Someone is burdened by having a lot of wealth, having a lot more wealth than everyone else, and having a lot of uncertainty. Why me? And then creating a moment where that person feels as though they are part of something greater, and they can contribute with their unique strategy, because maybe their family made money in the film industry, and so they have access to film distribution. Or that person's an extraordinary writer, and the story that exists in Portuguese that could change the world, it's never been written in English, and that person has the ability to do it. But in addition to that person's ability to create to be a part of some sort of systemic change process, there are family resources that can accelerate it. And it's when people feel as though they're more than just their money, that they get involved in a more deep way. And so it's a very, in many cases, it's a very emotional process. And so when they are really concerned about the problems of the world, and the person they are talking to or having dinner with has like the most convincing strategy for stopping that kind of suffering or environmental devastation they're so concerned about, and they feel as though they're part of the team, that perfect combination can inspire first of its kind generosity, like giving away half the family's wealth, or seldom that severe, but usually making the largest donation that they've ever done, or and this is more often than not, just making the first donation ever, right? You heard we talked about these numbers. For every family that gives $1 million away, there are 500 others that could, but haven't started to figure out how. It's like just getting people started is, how's the adage go? Any good journey begins with one step. So the quick story you told in Brazil is something that gets played out globally, and those are sort of the elements of the transformational process.
What I would add to that is if anyone has seen the documentary Born Rich by Jamie Johnson, who's been to Nexus, that documentary really encapsulates the burden of wealth and how insulated these kids are growing up from normal world, existence. And the analogy that we always use at Nexus is, think about money or currency as water. And if you have a stagnant pool of water, it just rots. But if you circulate water, it brings life. And that's what the monetary system can do, is provide life to places where otherwise it doesn't exist. And it's been so extracted from areas that there's no way for them to get back up onto their feet without an infusion of capital from the West.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And so, Jonah, we've known each other for a while now at this point. And it's interesting because the first time I came to your house for one of the first summits that I was involved in, your wife had the whole Ringing Cedars series laid out in the living room. And that was such a crazy universal sign and confirmation for me that I was in the right place and I was with the right people and I was getting involved in the right thing. Yeah, look at that. They've got the whole series right there. And so, Jonah, you and I have had a bunch of discussions for a long period of time about these ideas. And, I know you're a big believer in the Kin's-Domain idea, what it can do for the world, and Anastasia's philosophy and all these things in general. And like, what do I want to say here? I would really love, and maybe this can also tie in with the work that you're doing in the Amazon, but like, I would love if you can share some ways that how can people make this more successful? How can people start to get in front of these communities that we're talking about here, or these people who are able to how can you connect with someone in an emotional way that would inspire them to want to support this? So like, I remember when I was at Nexus, I was talking to a lot of people about this idea, and a lot of people gave me their verbal support, dozens of people, like that they would want to be involved in something like, the development of Kin's domains or giving some of their family land for it. We weren't in a position to do anything with that interest at that time, unfortunately. But basically, there was a lot of people there who believe in this idea and this way of life, and their mind was completely blown when I described it to them. And I said, it solves all the problems of the world. It's not just clean water and basic human needs. It's an entire societal transformation. It's a new paradigm. It's a new way of living for everyone, a new consciousness. And a lot of people really understood that. And what I would love for people to see how they can, how can we start to tap in to meet those people who really deeply care about the future of the world and want families to live happily and on their land and all these things, and want to make an impact and want to change. And how can that start to happen?
So you mean specifically how to access the wealthy families?
Yeah.
Yeah. So my access did not come from me being a peer in giving away $1 million, right? So how does a guy who isn't giving away $1 million able to convene a group of people who are? And the first step was me being useful to them. So some of them wanted to give away money. They wanted to know who and where and how. And I had hundreds of pre-existing relationships with change makers who were leading transformation in their given territories. So how to access those people? First, be super useful to them. A lot of them they have operating companies that might want to buy from the region where Kin's domain is producing. Many of them might be investors who want to, get involved in the new biodiversity market. And there's a standing forest near Kin's domain that is at threat of getting cut down. And so the community can come up with a project that can make it qualify for carbon credits or biodiversity credits because they're going to be protecting instead of cutting it down. And so that would be interesting to the investors in this circuit. The circuits of wealthy people. And then there are the philanthropists who are trying to figure out how to have the biggest bang for buck. And usually you can't access them directly. Often they will have a professional foundation, that does have a public door that you can knock on, or maybe you have a friend in common. And sometimes you can have a blank slate and there's a family that wants to start giving and they don't know what to, and maybe you can be the very first beneficiary, whatever calls. But that's a very, very rare circumstance to find yourself in. usually they've started a little bit, or they've started something, and you just have to, in many cases, just really have the best project out there that, as you mentioned, is solving all the problems of the world simultaneously. Having a program or a series of programs that appeal to all three of these interests, the corporate operating that might want to buy produce, the investment vehicle that might want to have a return on investment for something that's related, and the philanthropic investment that can have some outsized impact. So how to access them, often it helps to take your phone, go through the list of everyone in the phone that you have a big relationship with, figure out who those might be that have extra access to wealth, or who work in organizations that have extra access to wealth. Work on building a relationship with them, work on understanding what resources are at your disposal to have an outsized impact for a corporate buyer, an investor, or a philanthropist. And then start with small dollar requests. If you meet a millionaire and you ask for, $1 million, you're going to get a no. Asking for $1, that's an easier yes. So, begin small, demonstrate your utility to the family or the institutions or the company that's involved, scale up from there, become the most useful partner that they've ever had. And then once you've done that with multiple families, a lot of these families, are kind of isolated. They might be the only wealthy family in that city of Siberia. And there's real great value in them connecting with another family a couple of cities over. And so if you design this connectivity that creates opportunities for those families to convene, and especially for the next generation to sort of find identity and understand what struggles they have in common and ways that they can collaborate, then you as a convener of them are suddenly in this super useful position where they want more of you. And then you're able to kind of spread that pattern of usefulness and convening in a safe way, that's not about their corporations competing with each other, but about making the world a better place. Suddenly become useful for them, and you're able to, spread that pattern elsewhere.
You just gave me a great idea for something that our foundation can do going forward as we start to meet these people, and we can play that role of connecting the wealthy readers and people who want to do that. I already think of someone who would be part of that group. But that is a very interesting answer. And like, these are new ways of thinking, I think, for a lot of people. And what I want to ask is, so normally when I think about Kin's domains and I think about settlements and things, and I'd love like both of your thoughts on this. I don't necessarily see it as there will be much of a return on investment because there's going to be like families living there, and it's more about the legacy of those families like over time. And so do you see like the possibility of people just, how often does it happen that someone just gives a gift of money or land and they don't expect anything back, or they just get their payoff is less like a monetary thing and it's more like I've created a legacy and an impact? Does that happen more? Like,
it does happen. I don't have any statistics about what happens more than something else or how frequently it happens. One pattern that I can say is real is the more involved the family is, the more likely the generosity.
I see.
And I want to name a couple of new things, and I want to talk a little bit about the Amazon.
Please.
So there are people out there who study the cost of the loss of nature. Biodiversity loss does between $2 and $4 trillion in damage to the global economy every year. For deforestation, that means
Wow.
carbon emissions. It means desertification and the loss of arable land. And in many cases, that leads to human migration and increased poverty when you have, large concentrations of people in areas where there are not enough jobs available, or septic systems. In terms of biodiversity loss, just to give you a couple of examples, back in the 1980s, there was a popular statistic that 25% of pharmaceutical drugs were derived originally from research on tropical forest species. If you telescope today, the global pharmaceutical industry, maybe it's about $1 trillion. I don't have the numbers in mind. That means $250 billion a year in wealth that cycles each year that originally stemmed from biodiversity. The most effective way to solve our carbon problem is to plant trees, and
Right.
well, actually, what's even more effective than that is to prevent the cutting of new trees. And there is a book that I recently read called Restoration Agriculture, and it puts out some numbers. Basically, a farmer is a solar collector. And if you have a monoculture of any plant that is, let's say it's corn and it's all the same height, it's going to be effective at producing that monoculture. But if you have an agroforestry polyculture where you have low-lying species and high species, you can collect up to 8 times as much energy per unit of land in terms of sunlight, because sunlight bounces and there's shade-tolerant species and sun-hungry species, and only by having that diversity of plants can you really maximize your production. And by maximizing your production, you can produce a heck of a lot more. And by prioritizing a agricultural system that has trees in it, you can sequester tons of carbon, because that trees might be around for the next 300 years. So the world just in November, December had these landmark events. The meeting of the UNFCCC, the UN Panel on Climate Change, and the meeting on the Convention on Biological Diversity. One was in Egypt, the other one is in Montreal, Canada, and the capital markets are in a panic. They realize that the world is reaching this tipping point when it comes to biodiversity and deforestation. And if we overrun that tipping point, then we will lose the fight against climate change, or we need pollinators in order to keep these plants alive. And if we destroy too many habitats, the pollinators, the birds, the bees, the insects, they're going to disappear. There already is massive insect collapse and massive amphibian collapse that people read about. Kin's domains that are integrated with biodiversity and agroforestry strategies represent not only a strategy for carbon sequestration and greater biological diversity and global food security and the restoration of the water cycle, because trees are much better for the water cycle than low-lying annual monocultures. So advancing this new economic pattern is also going to be more and more every day super interesting to the global capital markets, because there's all of this accumulated wealth that is trapped in trapped in oil futures. And the biggest industry of the future is going to be biodiversity preservation and carbon. And read the book, The Ministry of the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. She lays out a very dramatic prediction for what the future is going to look like, of how she predicts in that book. It's a novel, so she estimates, in a fictional way, that Saudi Arabia is going to raise its hands and say, nope, we're not going to pull this carbon out of the ground. Instead, we're going to use this wealth to, restore nature of the world. So a lot of money can be made through nature restoration and through economic activities in partnerships with standing forests when there are accompanying pledges not to cut down those forests. That's where, in my analysis, the world's greatest future economic frontier is. You can make a heck of a lot of money preserving in the future. You will be able to make a heck of a lot more money preserving nature and restoring nature than cutting nature down. And unless you're at the forefront of making that happen in your entrepreneurship, you're going to miss the boat. And your family that has a lot of assets tied up in oil is going to lose it in a couple decades.
And can you explain the idea of making more money by preserving nature than by cutting down and extracting from nature? Like, where are the opportunities for people to make that money? Because, like, the 𝚐𝚘𝚎 domain model, it's 2.5 acres of land. There's a living fence of trees planted all around the perimeter. 50 to 75% of that 2.5 acres is a mix, polyculture food forest of all the various levels that you're talking about, plus a pond, a house, multiple beehives, flower garden, and all these things. Massive amount of diversity that's being tended basically for free by the family. So there's no expenditure for the labor to take care of it. And then that's being done at scale where it's a couple hundred families doing it. We just did an interview a couple months ago with a family in Russia, and they told that they're planting a couple hundred trees like per year on their domain, and that's just one 2.5 acre piece, and they live in a big settlement with like 100 other families. And so, like, where are the opportunities for people? Where is all this money to be made in the preservation of nature?
So I'll speak to the things that I know, which is about the Amazon. So there have been 70 million hectares of the Brazilian Amazon deforested since 1970. On average, there are 500 metric tons of carbon in 1 hectare of biomass above ground. If you reforest that, ran these calculations a few months back. If you reforest that 70 million hectares, to that natural capacity of 500 metric tons per hectare, and you're paying $80 per metric, $80 per metric ton, which when I did the research was about, equivalent of almost 80 euros. Where can you get $8 per metric ton? Some European carbon markets have been paying at that rate. That reforestation of the deforested Brazilian Amazon would be worth $2.8 trillion. So, where on earth can you find that kind of money? Who's willing to pay that? Right now, there is way more money that has been pledged for, biodiverse rich carbon, removal than is available. The high integrity carbon projects are in way undersupply. 10 years ago, way oversupply, prices way down. Now, like every day, more and more corporations are saying, I'm going to become carbon zero. I'm going to become carbon zero. Carbon alone is actually a dangerous story. How so? If we say to a nation, we're only going to give you this carbon money if your forests are under threat, and have been under threat for the past 5 years, which is what has been being said, then a lot of other countries are going to say, oh, well, the only way we can qualify for that carbon money is by putting our forests under threat. So, let's start cutting them down now. Maybe in 5 years we'll qualify for the money. So carbon alone is, and these low integrity carbon projects are actually a whole danger to the system. And that's what John Oliver and the whole anti-carbon offset movement has been pointing out. There are flaws in the system. Rather than carbon being in the lead of this new market development, biodiversity should be in the lead of this whole market development process. So the UN made a call to action during the Convention on Biological Diversity, saying biodiversity markets is where the future is. How many biodiversity credits are out there? There's an organization called the Biodiversity Credit Alliance, which is brand new. It's got a couple dozen organizations involved. The Anastasia Foundation should be one of those. You guys could be at the very leading edge of designing a new global economic system that really worships biodiversity over extractive culture. And the tens of trillions of dollars that are trapped inside of, this
oil futures.
Yeah, in oil futures, which you could call like sort of the carbon suicide economic plan of the future. They want a new place to land. And if there are governments that come on board saying, yes, we're about rewarding outcomes, we're about economies that prioritize biodiversity, then that can be the new oil markets of the future. The place where the big money opportunity is.
So let's say you saying, I love that you just brought up like the whole anti-carbon offset thing, because I have definitely thought that there are some flaws with that model as well. And so you're saying, instead of contributing to that whole carbon offset thing, taking that money and putting it into just biodiversity, right? And so is it a thing where it winds up being like biodiversity credits, or I'm trying to see how this plays out, and what I'm also envisioning happening, and you can correct me if you see some that I'm not getting it fully. But basically, if we were able to present the idea of kins, domains, and settlements, show the scale of the movement, show the fact that all these families are going to be doing this all on their own, basically, this would be a vehicle for people to say, like, instead of doing carbon offsets, they're investing in these settlements or this way of life and these projects, right, in order to increase biodiversity, to get all these benefits, right? Like is this making sense?
Yes, the real opportunity here is to get involved in the design of the new markets. So there are two major global level efforts that are transforming the global financial system. So there's an institution called the Financial Stability Board that is tasked with making sure the global financial system doesn't fall apart. And they have basically given birth to something called the Task Force on Climate Financial Disclosures, and then more recently, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. Every country around the world that is a member of the United Nations has been also tasked with the process of making a review of the ways in which it accounts for nature in its economic system. So the White House has been putting together an initiative called, it's like the Task Force on Nature Accounting Standards. That's not the name, but it's something like that. If you Google that online, you'll find it. So the world and the financial markets are in this process of figuring out how to rejigger the balance sheet so that we can save ourselves from the carbon problem that's facing us and from the biodiversity loss problem that is facing us. And these institutions are the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures is talking with hundreds of banks and others, and they are searching for solutions. The solutions are underdeveloped. The carbon solutions are more mature. They've been, the idea's been around for 15 years. The biodiversity market thing is brand new. The Rainforest X Prize, the X Prize Rainforest, has a
Yep.
$10 million prize out for the best technology for biodiversity monitoring. There are, I don't know how many, several dozen companies that are designing drones that can fly around and measure biodiversity. The industry is following to make these biodiversity markets viable, and they're underdeveloped, but there's billions of dollars that is already pledged to make them, valuable for the future. So getting involved in the design of those is a way to sort of lead the process of that new wealth creation opportunity. I'll just give one statistic. So last year, the powers that be that are involved in carbon financing made some conclusions. Carbon financing projects that exist in kind of isolation are not nearly as effective as carbon projects that are part of a jurisdictional or statewide strategy, because then instead of just favoring the best carbon project in one small area, you favor a constellation of them working together with state policies for enforcement and things like that in the process. So
I see.
Norway and Germany and UK and the United States, 4 countries, maybe even more, and 20 global corporations hold their funds, and they announced $1 billion through the LEAF Coalition that is going to be available for new carbon projects that have jurisdictional awareness. Okay, so there's $1 billion available, and indigenous nations can qualify for this money. It doesn't have to be a state government. It can be a federation of indigenous people that can get. I think they need to get recognized by the federal government as sort of being a sovereign entity, but the opportunities are there to basically make these new markets, make them high quality, make them high integrity, and to lead to lots of new wealth opportunities. And the financial markets want to do it as well and don't really know how. So they need partners like the Anastasia movement to get involved in the process and to design the new portfolio. If you guys can aggregate a couple hundred families that can have these great biodiversity outcomes, and they can work in tandem and measure the process, you guys might be able to qualify for a multi-billion-dollar agroforestry bond that has biodiversity credits and carbon credits embedded in it. How do you do that? By getting involved in the process of designing it. But Biodiversity Alliance, Biodiversity Credit Alliance is one of those groups that you should look up. The LEAF Coalition is one of those groups that you should look up. I can share with you, the names of several dozen organizations and financial players. Name the largest banks in the world: Citibank, UBS, HSBC. They all have staff inside their teams thinking, I don't know how to do this biodiversity thing. How am I going to set out this amount of land? How am I going to find 500 forest entrepreneurs that are going to pledge to do reforestation and biodiversity? I don't know how to do this. How am I going to do the accounting for it? It's possible to arrive at the table with those people, and I can introduce some of them and talk with them about the opportunity.
Wow, this is so mind expanding. Wes, you're going to say something?
Yeah, one thing that I would add is that there are these major trends that the financial powers are pushing towards. And one is the conservation or preservation of nature, which you're just allowing the destruction that we've created to continue, grow whatever is left. Whereas the Anastasia model, it's not conservation, it's stewardship of nature. So literally, you can infuse that biodiversity through our networks and through our seed banks. The other movement that the financial powers are pushing towards is the commodification of nature, or the tokenization of nature. And this is something else that is coming down the pipe pretty fast. But if you move to the Anastasia model, it's all about being local. It's all about morals and family. And I don't want to use the word preservation, but the stewardship of your hectare and the scale of that into a community, that model is hands down going to be far superior than just, oh, we're going to leave that forest exactly how it is and let it grow how it is. And you know, it's been ignored. And
Right.
if you continue to ignore it, it's not going to grow into the civilization that we know we can create as we include ourselves with nature. One of the big movements right now is the rights of nature. I brought a Nexus session on that. But what we have to recognize is that we are part of nature and we are the stewards of nature, like the Anastasia teachings explain. So creating this model with the human interaction and the foresight and the, you know, the love and consciousness that we can bring to the plants as they look to us for leadership, this is going to be far superior than, you know, just preserving hundreds of acres and preventing human contact.
I just want to counter or riff off that. In the situation of the Amazon, bang for buck wise, it is much smarter to protect than just reforestation, because many of these trees are hundreds of years old. They've got hundreds of years of carbon in them. And so if
Very interesting.
If you are spending $1,000 on, if you're spending $1,000 on, you know, regenerating that cattle pasture that was cut down for cattle years ago, or you're spending $1,000 on creating a permanent nature preserve or helping an indigenous community get sovereignty and land ownership, that $1,000 on the nature preserve or indigenous sovereignty is going to bang for buck be better for the carbon story, better philanthropic spend, et cetera. That reforestation process can follow a for-profit model. The making the standing forest more valuable than the cut forest is challenging, and there are business models that can do that, and that's what this may not be relevant for Siberia, but it is absolutely relevant for the Amazon. And indigenous people are really at the very center of this. There's a narrative in Brazil and in the Amazon at large that no, the indigenous people want to cut down their forests. They want economic development like the rest of us. That is true for maybe, I don't know, 1% of the indigenous community, not the 99% that are well organized in the articulation of indigenous people of Brazil or the coordinating unit of the indigenous people of the Amazon basin, et cetera. So the language and the semantics and the rhetoric that surrounds this is important at a political level. Indigenous people are so key because historically, you know, over, I don't know, a 50-year period, I'm making these numbers up, they only deforest 1% of their land, whereas the Western civilization, you know, descendants that, you know, set up shop in that area, who stewarded the same kind of geography that was originally the same biology, they deforested 65%, right? Or I don't know what the numbers are, but you know, the numbers are available. We can easily find them. Indigenous people are the most effective at preserving nature, and therefore they really need to be at the front of this new biodiversity market design and preservation and rewarding process. And that's why many of the largest grant makers who spend decades developing their strategy, when they enter the carbon market, they're like, oh, no, the strategy is not, you know, the new technology. The strategy needs to be prioritizing indigenous participation in these international events, so that this narrative that they want to cut down forests is invisible or is outcompeted by the narrative that actually indigenous people want to preserve things. And that's bang for buck, right? We have limited money in the world. Bang for buck, the best thing we need for our sustainable future and our biodiversity preservation is leadership of indigenous people and preservation of existing lands that are super biodiverse.
Right. Wow. And what you're saying here about the indigenous people being like the main force behind it kind of makes me think about particularly North America and what's happening like with the Ringing Cedars movement, because you have basically tens of thousands of willing families and hundreds of thousands of willing people that want to go on the land, want to plant all these trees, want to steward all this, not for any financial gain, but simply for the peace and well-being and health of their family, right? And so it's a very interesting thing because they're not necessarily motivated by right economic gain or anything. They're self-motivated. They don't even require much funding to do this. They're hungry to do this. And so what I hear you saying, what the idea is coming to me is that how can we present this model that is so regenerative, so biodiverse, so really not that expensive and laborious to manage or even do, to these new markets, these investors and these people that want to see like biodiversity in the future. And so something that we're working on, I don't know if Wes has told you about this, but we're working on a deck. There's like a group of 6 of us, really diverse thinkers and talents and skills that are, we're basically figuring out how to take someone who doesn't know anything about what a 𝚤𝚜𝚎 is or what it does or its impact on society and walk them through it, like a pitch deck about what it is, the problems that it solves, and the family aspects behind it, the biodiversity and all these things. And so we're working on that right now, and I hope to have a first draft done by like the end of January, and it's shaping up to be pretty good. And so like what am I saying here? Putting these ideas in front of well, actually my concern is that, do people see these things as a for-profit way of making money? Because maybe like your perspective can help widen my horizon here, because I keep seeing it as like these are families who want to preserve, just have a happy life and grow their garden and have children and live freely, right? But then there's also people who want to see an increase of biodiversity in the world, and they want these things to go. But like, does everyone look at it from the perspective of making money off of this activity, like this intrinsically family motivated kind of thing? Does this make sense?
Certainly not everybody looks at it as a way of making money. It's valuable to look at it a way of making money simply because of where money is available. The American philanthropic spend per year is $400 billion. But the gross national product is, I don't know what, $20 trillion. So the investment money is many, is dozens of times, if not hundreds, depending on your geography, hundreds of times larger than the philanthropic money. In terms of an individual family, like I've got a house in an urban center and I can sell it and have a little bit of money available and I can survive financially by going to a 𝚤𝚜𝚎, whether it's philanthropic or for-profit doesn't need to enter the equation of that family. But if you really want scale and you want to mobilize not 1 million for such a strategy, but instead 1 billion, then if you make a for-profit strategy out of it and you're able to demonstrate that model, then a bank might be able to give you $1 billion loan, or an operating business that pledges to buy, the next 3 decades of sustainably harvested wood that you're going to produce, right? If you're able to get Home Depot to sign a long-term purchase agreement, that can be turned into a bond, a corporate bond, or an agroforestry bond or something like that. And so we need the people who design these financial products to get involved in this process. And as the new biodiversity money and carbon money becomes available, it's going to sweeten the deal and make those things that could be financially self-sustaining actually far more successful, because the money wants to, the future money wants to chase a biologically rich future, biologically diverse and rich future.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And there is a way to tame the beast system and use its tools to create the future that we want. And what this reminded me of is book 1, Anastasia, where McGray compares the dacha gardens to the conventional farming of Russia, and how the dacha gardens outproduced the industrial farming. And I think if
Right.
we were to do that here in the West and keep the numbers and keep the proof of it, this is exactly the type of evidence we would need to go after this institutional money.
That brings up a great point. So Jonah, like one of the things that I could see large businesses being interested in is like the excess food and produce and everything that's produced on these domains. Like usually what happens is the families wind up selling whatever leftover they don't consume themselves, and that winds up being a large amount of the highest quality produce available, because 2.5 acres, once it's fully productive, is way more than any family would ever need. And then you have 300 families on that settlement doing the same thing. And then maybe that's a deal that can be organized, like, you know, this company decides to buy all this produce exclusively over this period of time, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where Nexus and the Amazon Investor Coalition, you know, are important partners. Many of the families that created some of the world's largest companies are in these networks, and you know they don't want to buy more of the same. They're super interested in buying, like if you have food A and food B, and they have an equivalent nutrient profile and they have an equivalent price, but one has like this amazing biodiversity restoration story behind it, you know, any corporate buyer is going to opt for that one because it's, you know, it's better for marketing, it's better for health, it's better for the planet's future, etc. So by designing these future farms in collaboration with a guaranteed buyer, you know, that socially responsible food company that, you know, wants to diversify its cereal with hazelnuts that you guys are going to be producing 5-10 years from now, you know, you work in concert. You help. Many companies are fearful that, you know, the carbon bomb that is coming in the future is going to eliminate. The sea level is going to rise. It's going to eliminate all the future markets that it's going to have access to. And so if you develop a long-term strategy with them about a business that is preserving nature and sequestering carbon, you know, and ensuring food security for that region, yeah, they're going to abandon their monocultures and join your polycultures, and everyone's going to make more money in the process.
Wow,
Yeah,
that's super interesting.
It kind of reminds me of our friend Jim Gale in Food Forest Abundance. You know, they didn't start too long ago, and they've grown quite quickly. But I think a couple of years from now, when it's, you know, they've created a lot of these food forests in people's yards, we're going to see how effective that is to the finances of, you know, of those localities, because you're not going to have to, you know, eat the conventional tomato anymore. You're going to have your own homegrown tomato and be able to circulate with that within your local community.
Yeah, this is very eye-opening. I was trying to
one
Go
other
ahead.
thing about, just because I said tomato, the 𝚑𝚒𝚒𝚒 community in the Ozarks has brought back a tomato thought to be extinct. And so now there's this is in the documentary Building 𝚑𝚒𝚒𝚒 Part 3, if anyone wants to check that out. But yeah, they found some old seeds from, you know, 50 some years ago, and they were able to get a couple to germinate, one survived, and from that plant they were able to reintroduce this tomato. So you want to talk about creation of the biodiversity, it is literally happening in some of these small eco-minded communities.
And this makes me think of, you know, the existing model of like the carbon offsets, right? It's like a lot of businesses pay a certain amount of money in order to plant a certain amount of trees to offset whatever carbon they're producing, right? But what if that was invested in something like the hundreds of families on one Kins domain settlement who are all planting hundreds of trees over a period of time? Like, I think that would be a more interesting and attractive investment for people, right? Like, that's another avenue potentially. Yeah, like
I
if we had
believe-
a
I
no, go ahead, go ahead.
If you could, Kin's domain or not Kin's domain, if you can aggregate agroforestry entrepreneurs, as a team to do things in kind of a regionally intelligent way with some carbon and biodiversity outcomes, wrap it in whatever brand you want. It's going to be attractive to the carbon offset market. I want to say one more thing about the carbon offset market. There is an argument that the carbon offset market is destructive because it allows some polluters a get out of jail free card, right? We can keep on polluting.
Just keep throwing money at
all
this.
these carbon offsets. The way that the Leaf Coalition has dealt with that is they put restrictions on who can buy those credits. A corporation has to have an internal plan where they're getting as sustainable as possible before they're eligible to buy those credits. The biodiversity offset market, the carbon offset market is a controversial story. We're in the beginning, we're in the very early ages of a brand new industry, of many brand new industries that the world has never seen now. And when many things get started, there's a lot of chaos and things go wrong. And theoretically, they continually iterate. And the voluntary carbon market is a space for that to happen. The compliance carbon market, which is hundreds of times larger, which is basically the regulated carbon market by a state, like a cap and trade system in California or something like that, represent a way to take the patterns of high integrity that you figured out and to really scale them. And so just for those of you in California, California did develop a protocol for a high integrity carbon market that can finance tropical forest preservation. It's called the California Tropical Forest Standard. And it has built within it strategies for FPIC, what's called free, prior, and informed consent. This is the way that you're supposed to appropriately involve Indigenous people in the consultation of the design of some sort of carbon product. In terms of future advocacy, if you're caring about these carbon offset markets, please push California to integrate its California Tropical Forest Standard within the state's cap and trade system. The dividends that can feed the Amazon rainforest are super needed and high integrity.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of the Amazon, I know you're involved in so much work down there. Can you share some of the models that you think would translate or inspire the people who are listening to this that have been successful down there? Like some of the initiatives that you've seen or that have been successful?
Sure. So there are dozens of commercially viable Amazonian plants. And if you were to grow them instead of cattle, you could earn a lot more and have better ecosystem services and biodiversity. I'll just share a few numbers with you. So cattle, which is the leading economic driver of deforestation, earns on average just $250 per hectare per year. Whereas mahogany, whether it's Brazilian mahogany or African mahogany, can earn in a sustainable long-term way $8,000 per hectare per year. That's literally 40 times as much per hectare per year. And then there are all of these products in between. Cashews, guava, and other kinds of timber, rubber, coffee, cocoa. Many of the world's largest commodities, palm oil, can grow in polycultures. They can grow as trees. They can replace cattle and create a much better economic story for the region. We've run some numbers. Here what we've come up with. We estimate that your average agroforestry polyculture could earn $3,750 per year. whereas your average cattle hectare, $250 per hectare per year. Soy, just $1,000 per hectare per year. So these things are can earn more per hectare per year than soy. There is an increased labor story. You can hear a couple numbers. Cattle, it takes 7 farm hands to steward 5,000 hectares of cattle. So a 5,000 hectare farm of cattle creates 7 jobs. Doesn't that sound exciting? A 5,000 hectare farm of a polyculture, and this has been really well documented for oil palm, creates how many jobs? 800. Think about that. It's more than 100 times as more, buddy.
And Jonah, break down how the current deforestation economy works.
Yeah.
So yeah.
90% of Amazonian deforestation in Brazil, which is where a lot of the statistics come from and where the highest deforestation rates are, 90% of Amazon deforestation is deemed to be illegal. About half of that 90% is driven by authentic attempts at poverty alleviation. So a family doesn't have, someone in the family is sick, you need to bring them to the doctor. The money doesn't exist for the transportation. You cut down the trees, you expand the cattle production, you get your mother-in-law the medicine she needs, right? So economically, it's you can forgive those people and give them a new kind of job. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But there's a lot of that, the other 50% of that 90% of illegal deforestation is driven by organized crime. So there are gangs, many of which are tied into narco trafficking, the illegal drug trade locally, that go into the cities. They get people to sign documents. They then use those names to get land that has been illegally deforested and occupied, often on government land. They use those names to then beg for land titles. Oh, look at this name. This person's not a landholder. They're poor. Give us these 50 acres. Reassign, give them amnesty. Reassign it from government land to privately owned land. All of a sudden, you have an asset that has been organized and deforested and managed with illegal money. And all of a sudden, they've gotten this amnesty. In many cases, there's corruption. They've lobbied some politician who's then pushed for that amnesty, and correspondingly, that land is now legal and it can be sold. And so there's a land grabbing and money laundering story in the Amazon, and that needs a lot of philanthropy to get in there and digitize the land registries. It needs greater law enforcement. The local indigenous populations that are often on the suffering end of that need technology and training to they need GPS-enabled cameras and drones to monitor this. They need a direct line of communication with local public prosecutors. There's a whole anti-deforestation, restore the rule of law process that is hard to achieve with a for-profit model. A lot of philanthropy and restoration of the rule of law is needed there. And that's not something that, forest-friendly entrepreneurship can solve by itself. But a lot of that is given permission to operate because of this poverty story. So what are the business models that can work? You ever heard of the company Sambazon? That company is now worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It's 20 years old. It's the largest retailer of acai in this country. Where does it get its acai? It gets its acai from forest dwellers who go into the forest. They harvest these berries from standing trees in well-preserved forests. They go back to the processing center and they sell them. And that's their annual income. And so rather than cutting down trees and running cattle, they are harvesting produce from standing forests. Brazil has, it's like 7, 8, or 9 different kinds of zoning fir forests, they're indigenous reserves, they're national parks. Another one of them is called extractivist reserves. Extractivist is a word in Portuguese which means wild harvesting, extrativista. It basically means this source is set aside. You can't cut down its trees, but you can take out its nuts and berries and other things like that and bring commercial value to them. Acai is done this way. Brazil nuts are done this way. Dozens of other products are done this way. If we can increase the consumption of Brazil nuts and acai and plenty of other forest products, wild harvested cocoa, chocolate is being harvested this way, then we will be able to make sure that these standing forests and the populations that live within them are earning a heck of a lot more money than they would by running cattle or soy. And so a couple things need to be done. One, we need to lobby all of the chocolate companies in the world to become the world's carbon negative chocolate. We need to make wild harvested chocolate, the Gucci, like the highest premium, most expensive stuff that you want to give to your family for the holidays. Another thing that needs to be done is tracing where is this chocolate? How do you ensure that it's coming from a wild harvested supply chain? We need, the fintechs to get involved with that tracing process. So part of it is consumer demand, part of it is organizing the corporate supply chain, part of it is organizing the new financial products that integrate carbon, forest preservation money and biodiversity preservation money, which can come from for-profit financial instruments to get involved in the pricing of this wild harvested chocolate, acai, Brazil nuts, cupuaçu, you name it.
Yeah.
One thing I would add is that the other smart thing that 𝚑𝚒𝚒 did is they built processing plants right there in the communities that are harvesting the berries. So they're also creating job opportunities in those areas and not just extracting it from the forest and sending it to the west straight away. They're creating opportunity right there. And Jonah, you're talking about chocolate. Did you want to give �値𝚒𝚒𝚜 a plug and talk about that?
So �値𝚒𝚜 is not the one to get the pub. Louisa Abram Chocolates is the one to give a plug. So the Mendez chocolate, Louisa Abram chocolate, there are already a number of forest product providers that need visibility. So if you are, I don't know, Kim Kardashian, and you have hundreds of millions of followers, tweet about these brands so they get sold out instantly, and there's like years of demand for what they have to offer. What does that do? That sends a signal to the local forest entrepreneurs. Oh, wow. Oh my God, that chocolate company is really taking off. Man, instead of cutting down,
let's go more in that direction.
How to become a chocolate wild harvesting entrepreneur.
And everything you're saying is hitting all the things that kin domains fit. Like, for example, if you have a giant settlement, you got 350 families producing this huge diversity of nuts, fruits, and everything, that can be done as a large business. And then, man, what were you saying here, Jonah? You said there was three things that things that you were just saying.
And corporate buyers.
Right. And man, I kind of lost my train of thought, but that's it's a local thing, right? You have all these families that are there doing it. They're not cutting down, it's not extractive, right? There are constantly being new trees and new things planted and tended. And like, for example, the 𝚑𝚒𝚒𝚒 example, I could see that happening in North America in some years with all the people who have all the different nut trees and all the things that are growing on their domains, right? And you were saying to make that cool too. You were saying to make that like the trend where, for example, I think in the 5th book, Anastasia talks about the future. She models the future of what's going to happen after all these domains start spreading across the world. And she says the price for kin's domain food specifically is going to be many times the price of even just normal organic food. And so that eventually when that phenomenon becomes known and the businesses catch wind of the fact that there are families who are personally tending this with love and care, zero chemicals at all, huge biodiversity, like that creates its own market. It becomes this big premium product, right? And we can position this movement as the future of everything, right? Because there's going to be so much food being produced at a large scale by all these people living on their land that we can start to feed a large portion of the population. Like Wesley said earlier, the example of the dachas in Russia, like these small backyard gardens, which are like 600 meters square or less, it produces more than 50% of the country's food on like less than 10% of the usable agricultural land, which is like shocking. And the government doesn't really do anything. You know, it's just people who have these summer houses in Russia, and they go there in the summer and they grow all their food, and that's how they do it. It produces a huge, like 90% of the country's potatoes are produced that way in small backyard gardens, and all these other fruits and things. And so you're really starting to light my brain up with the possibilities of the future, here, like in North America, and how these things can become more successful and get funding and things.
I want to give voice to a debate that I have heard. There's some we haven't touched on yet. It's relevant, and that's about the future of global food security. Some people make the argument that we got to cut down the Amazon or any given forest to make room for growing new crops so that we have enough food to feed everybody. If your purpose was really to feed
Monocultures.
everybody, would you say?
I said those are all monocultures in their mind. They're like, these are monocultures of soy and whatever. They're not thinking biodiverse polyculture systems.
But the biggest part of the equation that they ignore is the story of animal protein. So it takes 40 times as much land. I'm making the numbers out of it, but it's something like 40 times as much land to produce 1 ton of beef as it does 1 ton of plant biomass, right? Or plant or fruits or nuts, or whatever, edible plant produce. And the trend is for animal protein production to fall when it's grown on farms, and instead to grow it in the lab. So the argument that we need to cut down more pristine forests in order to ensure global food security is a lie. It's simply not true. We're going to achieve it in the lab, and we can create a lot more food by making land use changes away from this super inefficient system of cattle in the Brazilian Amazon to agroforestry, or you pick your animal, switch it out for vegetarian diets, and you're on your pathway to much greater food security.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then, well, when you say food security, all I'm thinking is that I keep going back to the 𝚝𝚒𝚒𝚝 thing. It's one family has 2.5 acres where they're growing this huge diversity of things. And like, if people could see the validity of this model, because it's already been done. There's over 1,000 settlements in Russia, and the largest ones are 400 families, and they're like 25 years old. You know what I mean? And like, it's super successful, and it's spreading like wildfire, even without that much support. Now the governments over there are starting to get behind it, but it's like, how I see it is that this model is the ultimate answer for food security, right? It's 2.5 acres, every family, they're growing this huge diversity. And then the trade and the economy that develops in that community. Like when I was in Russia, I remember they traded this giant, it was like a 40-kilo bucket of honey for a whole bunch of different produce and things that their neighbor grew. And they're just bartering and doing all this. So whatever this person doesn't grow, this person does, and they exchange. And then whatever they all don't need, they sell as surplus to the local communities around them, and things like that. And so it's like this thriving economic model. And yeah, I'm not exactly sure what I want to say by all that, but I'm hoping that for everybody who's listening, that this gets your brain working as to all the possibilities that we can make these things a success. right? Because like Jonah has said, there's so much money and so many different areas that is there. Simply, we need to put the proper offer in front of the proper people in order to start tapping into that, because our options are way broader than we think, right? And actually, to that point, I wanted to circle back to sort of a smaller scale aspect of it, where, like, let's say I'm a group of like 10 people, and I'm like, I want to live on my land. I want to plant this garden. I want to have my kin's domain. I don't personally have money. Even together, all 10 of us, we don't necessarily have enough money to buy a suitable piece of land or something. And we want to start making, we want to start making steps to getting some land and building this life, right? Like, how could those people put together this idea and get funding, even if they don't have like a network or connections? Are they just cold calling like land trusts? Are they cold calling like family foundations? They're going to places, and like, do you see what I'm saying? Like, how could people start to tap into these kinds of things?
So the answer to that changes depending on whether you're going for philanthropic support or for-profit support. I'll give an answer about the for-profit support first, and then I'll talk about the philanthropic support. So in order to most of the easy money that's going to be available will be from the traditional financial system. It'll be for a mortgage. And in order to qualify for the mortgage, to buy that land or whatever it might be, you need to have demonstrated history of income. And so rather than going for a 100-acre farm, go for a 2-acre fee or whatever it might be. Get a year or 2 years of financials showing your ability to make a profit off of that, and then then you'll qualify for your first loan to buy, or your first mortgage to buy a larger piece of land. If you want to go for the 100-acre story, then create a for-profit entity that is able to, a corporation that is able to demonstrate its ability to do that. So you develop an operating model, you have a whole business model, you have a board of directors, you have a couple years of financials. You demonstrate your ability to repeat this several times, and all of a sudden you have an investable product where it's not just, Corporation A isn't depending on families X, Y, and Z. Corporation A has a demonstrated track record. No matter how much money you give them or what geography, they can go stamp it out somewhere else around the world, because that's what they do. That's their business model. And so, and if you develop it like Jim Gale that Wes was talking about, if you develop it as like a venture thing that has like infinite scaling possibilities, you might even be, and it has some technology involved that makes it easier for farmers to monitor what they've got going on, et cetera, then you may be able to get like that high risk outsized money that is really looking for scale. And there's actually a startup that for agroforestry that is super relevant for that, called Propagate Ventures, that you should look up, because there may be a business partnership opportunity with them.
Interesting.
We know them, don't we?
Right. And yeah, we do. Ethan and the team over there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing on the financial side that I would say is, I'm against going into debt to any of these financial institutions. So what I would say is start super small. If all you can afford is a 1/4 acre, or not even just maybe your backyard of your apartment building, if you start growing, say, cabbage, okay, one cabbage, let's say, is worth $1. But if you turn that cabbage into sauerkraut, you can 10x that dollar easily, I think one of the young entrepreneurs out there is Fermentation Fairy, and they're just taking produce and fermenting it, and literally taking small scale farming and making a profitable business at it. So basically, anything that you create, turn that into something else. If you're going to harvest a tree is worth whatever, but you turn that tree into a table and chairs, you're 10, 20xing your money. You know, this is how I think that would be my strategy as far as like moving forward, as opposed to going into debt to any of the financial institutions. Start small, but be smart about it and learn how to, you know, upsell your produce.
On the philanthropic side, there are some coalitions of funders that pay attention to these things. One is called the Agroecology Fund. Another one is called TIFS. Let me look up what it stands for. It's called, this is not for philanthropy, but, well, actually there are some big grant-making foundations involved. It's called Transformational Investing in Food Systems. And I can share, and there are others. So if you search out there, you know, foundations, land use, nature-based solutions, philanthropy, you know, and you pull on that thread, you'll be able to find a number of grant-making foundations that are either associations of grant-making foundations that are focused on these things or individual ones. If it's in the Amazon, just look at the website of amazoninvestor.org. And if you know, look around that website, you can find lists of dozens of investors and grant makers that are focused on that region.
Right. Yeah, and we do have some people in South America, so that's very useful. And like, yeah, I'm just really trying to get people to see that this is a lot more accessible and possible than we might have previously imagined, because for people who are trying to get into this, money winds up being an obstacle, right? Or resources. They have the skills, they have the capability, but the initial money to get the land and to start the first stages of the building winds up being such a big obstacle for some people, right? But those same people, if they were to take their plans and put it into, you know, something that they can present to any of these groups that you're talking about here, then there's a really, you know, with persistence, they could really have a shot at like getting the money and the resources that they need, right? And it's like, we don't necessarily need to just look to the government or all these other entities to get us these things. And so I really hope everybody who's listening that what we're discussing, Jonah, Wes, and I, like, can start to broaden your horizons. And I'm encouraging you to think creatively about how you can fulfill your plans here, because there's a million ways to do it. It just takes, you know, careful presentation of what you have to do and getting it in front of the right people. Like, there's tons of people who are willing to help. It's just they don't know about it and they need to be informed and educated.
One success story I would say people could look up is Polyface Farms in Virginia. Worth looking into. You know, it's basically a very biodiverse, you know, they have animals, they have plants, they all work together. Yeah, look up Polyface Farms.
Yeah. And Jonah, you know, something I just thought of is, like, we're going to be republishing the books, right? And so we're going to have hundreds of thousands, millions of new people reading the books and being inspired by this vision of life. And there's going to be a lot of renewed interest in this. And we're going to see a huge, you know, I call it like a second wave of the Ringing Cedars and Anastasia, like worldwide, really. And so what am I trying to say here? How, like, large investors or philanthropists and individuals and families are gonna see this, right? Or we can make them aware of this. You know, we're gonna have a large amount of people, larger than we have now. And I'm not exactly sure where I'm trying to go with it, truthfully. But what I'm trying to say is there's going to be a lot of eyes on this, and there's going to be a lot more people involved. And so I think that this would be a lot more appealing and viable to people if they know that there's a giant amount of people who want to do this, right? It's like, if we give you the funds and the access and the help and all these things, then the supply of people who are willing to fulfill these plans is virtually infinite. right? And I think that's pretty appealing to people who are willing to fund and help these things.
I want to riff off that. So the Kin's Domains and the Anastasia books have certain religious and spiritual messages behind them. They represent a minority of the religious and spiritually motivated people in the world. The Catholic Church, in response to climate change and a lot of the other biodiversity destruction problems that humanity is facing, started a new movement called Laudato Si, which is really based on reverence for nature. There's a book called The Immortality Key that lays out all this archaeological evidence that the origin of many of the world's religions might come from psychedelic experience. And there's a lot of research that shows that psychedelic experience results in a reverence for nature. I'm going down this line to say that those religious and spiritual movements that are tied into reverence of nature and agricultural models that restore humanity are far too few. And as a inclusive movement, the Anastasia community is really well positioned to get involved in the interfaith community. So so that you can compel, desert populations in Arab countries that are primarily Muslim to also get involved in back to land movements. Solar power is much cheaper than it used to be. We can come up with strategies to desalinate water. We can regreen the Middle East. We can regreen all this desertification that has been happening through human ingenuity and new entrepreneurial models. And those movements that are most effective at spreading and maintaining discipline are those that do have a religious and spiritual center. A couple decades ago, I looked at who my heroes were: Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa. So many of the world's leaders of social movements come from a religious and spiritual tradition. And so today we see something called the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, where people from diverse religions understand the value of the rainforest and engage in advocacy processes to promote its conservation. My suggestion: may the Anastasia movement become the tip of the spear of new agroforestry entrepreneurship and wealth creation and financial product design, so that you can infect the communities of consciousness and spiritual curiosity and religious devotion around the world to adopt the same patterns of human preservation and nature preservation that you guys are propagating.
Yeah, well, it should, right? It should, because like you're saying, it's inclusive to every religion. It's not exclusive to any peoples. I was just discussing this with my wife last night. Like, so many of the religious teachings around the world they're really like geographically focused, right? And the prophets, at the different times that they came in the world, they came and they gave their message for a specific people in a specific way at a specific time. But like the message of the ringing cedars is universal to everyone in the world right now, for the rest of time, forever, to some people in Africa and Europe, North America, the Hawaiian Island, like everywhere. And it's viable to everyone, and it doesn't exclude any religious beliefs, and it just builds upon them, right? Because, basically saying that the land that we're stewarding is God's creation, and we're connecting with God through taking care of this land that we've been trusted with. And so there's this giant potential too, like getting integrated with all these religious movements and everything, and trying to bring that consciousness into religion even more, right? Like the large religious movements that are across the world. It's like, yes, let's develop ourselves and be the virtuous and best versions of ourselves that we can be, and let's improve society. But then let's also like remember that we're on God's green earth, and that we need to take care of this, and that we can have happy, beautiful families on this green earth that we've been given by God, right? Because maybe that can be like a religious renaissance in its own way, and everything can we can start to integrate these things. So I look forward to that day, and that's a beautiful vision that you just planted in my mind and in the mind of all the people here. You know, the opportunities and the universality and the effectiveness of this movement is just like unlimited. It fits into everything. It solves everything, and all we need to do is just get it in the right places. So Jonah, I want to be respectful of your time here. I know we've been going for almost 2 hours now. I want to ask, I mean, first of all, that was like a tour de force of amazing and mind expanding information. Like, I'm gonna have to watch this again. I wish I could get somebody to transcribe this and put it into a blog post, because there's so much useful information here that I think people should come back to. But is there anything that you want to share with our audience, like in closing, anything that you feel inspired to say, or anything we may have missed?
Love is a pattern that includes all. Adopt the pattern of inclusion, and you'll have success.
Wise words. Good to think about. Wes, is there anything you want to add in here, brother?
I think the only thing left in the back of my mind is when you were talking to Bruce Perlowan about growing hemp, and he was talking about how there's a perfect amount of hemp to grow. I don't remember, it was maybe 40 acres. Anything more, the processing gets unhandily. Anything less, it doesn't make financial sense. And then the other aspect of that was having the hands on deck to go and harvest that hemp for the 2 days in the year where it needs to be harvested. And I'm thinking to the Kins domain settlement model, where that would just work perfectly, where you have the whole community come together for 2 days a year to do the harvest, and then you're out. So there is power in community, and hands down, it's going to be more powerful than some corporation where people will hate their job and they got to, everything's for the dollar, and it's just that's the dead and dying system that we're all growing out of.
Yeah, and like, my mind has been so open as to all these possibilities, like 300 families, each with a hectare of land, and they're growing chestnuts and hazelnuts and apples and peaches and plums and grapes and berries and all these different things. Or you can even take a piece of the land on the community and set that aside, 40 acres of hemp, right? And everybody can come together and do that. 40 acres of chestnuts or walnuts or whatever. I know that, what's that nut? Hickory. There's some species of hickory that produce a lot of oil, and that's like an undertapped market. If you start pressing that for oil, and you get a whole bunch of people to come together and do that, and do that as a large business, as a community, there's a million things that we can do. And so, yeah, well, thank you, Jonah. I'm super grateful for your time. I know that our community is grateful for your time. Thank you for doing what you do in the world, Jonah. You're such an inspiration to me. I talk about you all the time to everybody I know. I'm super grateful for your presence and help and mentorship in my life. I love you, man. You are an inspiring, beautiful human being. So grateful to know you. Thank you for everything that you contribute. Thank you for believing in what we're doing here, and taking the time to do this. And once we're more ready with our things, I'd really love to connect with you again and see how we can take these things forward, because I know that you've got all the ways to help us move things forward, but I want to take it slow and steady. But when we're ready, I don't want to waste your time. So we'll reach out and keep things going. But thank you.
Sounds great, Gabe. Thanks so much.
Ciao.
All right, everybody.